The Bengals are back in Cincinnati to start the offseason program. So we've got updates to share. Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Lisco. He's your host, James Rapine. We're going to break down everything we learned as the Bengals reconvene for their offseason program, including minor updates on the franchise. Joe Burrow expected to, things are going well. We'll talk about what's going on with Dax Hill as well. You can find this show on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. So if you're new, please do subscribe. It really helps us. We appreciate it, and it makes it easier for you to find our content when we upload. Today's episode is sponsored by Gametime. You can get $20 off your first purchase of tickets in the Gametime app today when you make an account and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. James, let's start with what Zac Taylor had to say, meeting with the media for the first time in a while, talking about the offseason program. And it's Zac Taylor at the podium. He knows what he's doing up there at this point, but there's still things to glean anytime we hear from the head coach for the first time in a while.
Well, sure. First things first, Joe Burrow. What did he have to say about Joe Burrow? Well, it was certainly thumbs up, wrists up, pinkies up, whatever you want to say. There were no faces. There was no hesitation when discussing Burrow's recovery, rehab, all of those things. And I think at this point, there's just such a trust factor between Zac and Joe. And I asked Zac about this. He talks more to his staff about Joe in the recovery and all of those things versus going up and asking Joe how things are going, because he just kind of knows how Joe's going to approach it and all of those things. And Joe gets asked it a ton. Zac said he's been asked it hundreds of times this offseason how Joe's doing. And that makes sense too. So you don't want to be that 1,252nd time asking Joe if you're Zac. But thumbs up for Joe Burrow, which is where it starts. It's where this offseason starts and ends when it comes to this Bengals team. And yet at the same time, I did think it was interesting, and this has to do with the trust factor. Zac said he hasn't seen Joe throw yet, which is interesting. He's been throwing. We've talked about it. We talked about it like a month ago. So he's been throwing, but it is interesting that Zac admitted that, I haven't seen him throw yet.
Perhaps since he spoke with you, he has seen Joe throw. That's
true.
A possibility.
This was pre-meeting. This was their first meeting, just to be clear.
So. And that is the start of this, is they're having their first team meeting to set the priorities and the goals for the offseason program, which Zac Taylor talked about as well. Just getting ready for training camp, making sure that everybody knows what's going on with their systems, what the major points of emphasis are going to be this year, getting everybody that's new up to speed a little bit, starting to get caught up, ready for some of the 11-on-11 walkthrough kind of speed stuff they're going to do, ready for 7-on-7s and the rest of the work they're going to do in the offseason program, which is, of course, very light, relatively speaking. The Bengals generally keep things pretty light in their training camp and their offseason program as far as padded practices go, but the NFL in general, big emphasis on trying to minimize those injuries that happen outside of the season, and so it is a slow start.
It is, and that's that falls in line with it. I wasn't expecting Zac today to say, "Oh well, yeah, Joe's throwing 60-yard bombs to Jamar. They're right out there. Did you not see them?" At the same time, they were literally just getting there as we were there. You know, some of these guys were shaking hands for the first time in months and seeing each other for the first time, and so it will be interesting to start to ask some of these teammates that are catching passes from Joe Burrow how Joe looks, whether it's on the mic or off the mic, and continue to watch him. And obviously Zac is going to see him throw, and this team is going to see him throw and catch passes from him. Andre Yosavash, for example, Charlie Jones, some of these guys. Obviously the T. Higgins factor, I don't expect to see him. Zac wouldn't speculate. Well, I will. I would be shocked if T. Higgins shows up in any time between now and long after the start of training camp, to be quite honest with you. So that'll be something we keep an eye on as well. But the fact that Joe Burrow is doing well, the fact that the offseason program is here, it's a sign, by the way, Jake, that the draft is almost here too, because we do this last year was they had just signed a few guys. And I remember asking Zach about, how does this open things up for you draft wise? Because they had signed Irv Smith Jr. and they had brought back Drew Sample and they had added, I always forget his name. Why do I keep doing that? The defensive end from Dallas, Terrell Basham. Terrell Basham. And obviously I ended up taking a defensive end in round 1 anyway. So yeah, it's just another sign that the draft is right around the corner.
Yeah, the draft. Well, the rest of our content between now and the draft is going to be about the draft, so we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. Were there any interesting offerings from Zac Taylor as far as the draft went that you took away? I know he kind of said, that's a better question for Duke Tobin when he was asked about, I don't remember what exactly it was, but he was asked a draft-related question that he said, you should ask Duke, and we will hear from Duke in the near future as well. But any draft tidbits that you gleaned reading between the lines?
Well, I've been pretty outspoken, and when we'll talk about T'Vondre Sweat a bit with Dane Brugler on tomorrow's show, amongst a bunch of other topics as well. But the Sweat example, right? And Ben Baby asked Zach about what he looks for in a receiver, and it was talking about receivers, had nothing to do with T'Vondre Sweat, and he brought up how they take care of themselves, how accountable they are. The character stuff, like they look at all of that. And I think that's such a high priority. And it was a reminder for me, not just at receiver, even though that was the question. That's what they're looking for. They want guys that are that they don't have to check in on. And that's how they've built this. It's worked and it makes a lot of sense. And so we'll see if that can continue, because obviously the Sweat debate. But as far as receiver goes, there's a lot of receivers, and so once the draft talk switches to that, we will talk about it. But yeah, that stood out to me just because it just hit home again, hammered it home that's what they're prioritizing.
Yeah, we know that this particular iteration of Bengals front office, Bengals drafting, the Zac Taylor Duke Tobin duo leading the football operations side of the Bengals world, has emphasized character, has emphasized captains, has emphasized players in major schools and major games and major conferences, especially early. Mm-hmm. And so that is something that I think we'll discuss. And it does come up when we talk today and T'Vondre Sweat and even reuniting him with Byron Murphy, right? And that idea, that was like a 1-4 combination, is something that we discussed. But for the Bengals, it might be a little bit hard to imagine. They do start to bend their rules. And we saw it last year with Charlie Jones being a great example of this, Andre Josevich being another one at wide receiver, going back to where this started, a wide receiver question. And those guys not checking, height, weight boxes in Charlie Jones' case, and neither of them checking the early production box. They love receivers who break out at a young age and are a big part of their college offenses when they're 18, 19 years old, like Jamar Chase, for example, like Tyler Boyd. When he was very young, he was producing at a very high level for Pitt. And those guys didn't fit those boxes, but that was on day 3. And so that's where you start to see the Bengals veering away from some of their thresholds and requirements. And maybe you see that for T'Vondre Sweat, but it'll be interesting to hear what Dane has to say. I'll just say that about these nose tackles, because it's a tough year for nose tackle, as we've discussed, I think, on this show a few times. But Dax Hill has been a subject of much scrutiny and discussion and questioning from this podcast, from Bengals fans, from the media in general, when meeting with Bengals coaches and brass throughout this offseason. We may have some answers. We may have some indication of what the direction is for Dax Hill, and Dax met with the media as well. We'll discuss Dax Hill's potential role coming up next.
Locked On Bengals is sponsored by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and to make it a priority. And maybe what's important to you is figuring out exactly how to use Dax Hill and maximize his value, or figuring out exactly how to put these pieces of the Bengals roster together. Well, therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. If you thought about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and flexible. So maybe you're traveling for work. Maybe you have a 3-day marathon that's also a sprint with the 2024 NFL draft coming up. And maybe you have 10 picks. Well, BetterHelp can still be here for you, whether you're a fan of the team or whether you're a podcaster, whether you're a listener. So make sure you check out BetterHelp today. All you have to do to get started is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and sign up today at betterhelp.com/lockedon. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon.
There wasn't a direct Dax Hill is going to play X position. Dax Hill is going to do this role for us from Zac Taylor. Dax Hill didn't say it either, but what Zac Taylor did say is that they have a plan. And for a lot of this offseason, you kind of had to read between the lines to see what the plan is, because when asked, coaches and front office individuals, Duke Tobin, when asked, well, the coaches have to figure out what to do with him. Or Dax is good at a lot of things. We need him to be good at one thing. We need him to be great at one thing. And well, you start to have an idea at this point as to what they are going to do with Dax Hill in 2024.
Well, a couple of things. Yeah. You start to get that idea. And part of it is you look at that safety room. And here's my fear. I don't know if it's true, like factual, but my fear is that they're going to yank around this former first round pick, who's one of the most athletic players on the defense. He had an up and down first year at safety. And they stumbled into Von Bell. They didn't realize they were getting Von. I know they targeted Geno, but now Dax is just a backup nickel, backup outside corner. And then if you have issues at safety health-wise, then he can line up there as well. Like, it's just, it's really weird. That's how it does feel. He said he's ready to play anywhere. But, and you mentioned this right before we started recording, Jake, they haven't signed a corner. And it kind of ties into what I mentioned last year. They like to shore up positions before the draft. Joe Bachie, and we can react to more about that in just a second. But Joe Bachie signed today, a 1-year deal. Why? Well, takes the pressure off of adding another special teams linebacker in the draft if it doesn't fall your way with those 10 picks. You don't need all 10 now. You can move up or do whatever. And so maybe they just view him as a corner and he's going to play the nickel and he's going to be Mike Hilton's backup. And they'll have some packages where Mike Hilton comes off the field and they have Dax Hill. Maybe he's going to try the boundary corner stuff and see if maybe he can be their backup corner. I don't know. I just think it's a lot to ask. And if he doesn't hit the ground running there, well, now you've just tried him at all these spots and you've never just put him somewhere and let him learn and let him take his lumps. Dax Hill was not awful last year. A lot of people want to say that. He had 110 tackles, 2 picks, should have had 5 or 6 picks. And there were some bad moments, especially in the back quarter of the season. Well, you know what I find myself wondering? I was like, damn, too bad they wouldn't have had a few more bad moments. They wouldn't be picking 18. They'd be picking 10. And we'd be having a different conversation, right? So at the same time, I get it. I get adding to the safety room. I just wonder where it leaves Dax, because he is talented. I think the ceiling is really high. And I wonder how many snaps he's going to get at safety this season, because that feels pretty low.
It's a pretty divisive question as to whether or not Dax Hill should play cornerback. When they drafted Dax Hill, I remember right after the draft, I asked Mike Potts in one of our better episodes of the year when we get to talk to Mike Potts after the draft, and hoping to repeat that this year. Can Dax Hill play outside corner? Is he that versatile? Mike Potts didn't really hesitate. They thought he could play anywhere in the secondary, which is fine when you draft him. But going into your 3rd year, you should know who a player is and what he's good at and where he can help you, especially a first-round pick. And it's not that Dax is strictly a bust. He didn't get to play his first year because the Bengals were deep enough at safety that he didn't really get onto the field a whole lot. He played a little bit of corner for them when they were in dire straits, but it's not like he was repping there for all of training camp and practicing there all year. I think the moment, from a player development perspective, if you wanted Dax Hill to play corner, which, if they thought he really could, they value corner more highly than safety. That would have been as a rookie. They would have said, you know what, Dax, we're gonna work you at corner, and we're gonna
And that
develop
was
you
the
that way
time
the whole
because they
time.
had Bates and Bell. Like that was the
Exactly.
time to do it. Yeah.
Exactly. But then Bates doesn't show up for camp. And so they get all these safety reps for Dax in camp. But the time to make these kinds of decisions, ideally, is not going into your third year when you've had 2 years of trying to work towards safety and some work in at the slot, some work in outside in the middle. And he was a slot corner for the most part in his role in Michigan.
Mhm.
So it's fine if you draft him and project him to be a safety, and then you work him as safety. It's fine if you draft him, you think, you know what, we're going to give him a chance at corner,
Mhm.
the more valuable position. And then if it doesn't work because he's athletically limited in whatever way you think he can't hang at corner, we'll move him to safety. And like I said, it's a fairly divisive issue. Joe Goodberry has Twitter rants out there you can find. We're going to be talking to Joe this week, is why I bring it up. Not about this, but about the draft. He has a Twitter rant out there of a video of him going off about them moving Dax to corner if that's the plan.
Yeah.
And when you read into, bringing in Bell and Stone, and we kept saying, like, we're expecting them to get another corner. They like to have extra corners. They like to have that veteran piece of corner. Well, if Dax is a plan, that could explain, and I still think they should sign a corner, but if Dax is a plan to be your additional depth at corner piece, maybe that's why they haven't done it. But why this decision is happening now from a player development perspective just doesn't seem like a good plan. It seems mismanaged to me. Maybe it works out. Maybe he emerges and is awesome and is their starting outside corner on opening day.
Yeah.
But does it feel like that's a plan right now? He would have to really impress him, I think, for it to get all the way there from where it is now, where they've signed his replacement in free agency.
It feels like he's buried. Yeah. I mean, I think Jordan Battle has to earn a starting job at safety, right? Because they bring in Bell and Stone, if that's the case. And yet I could make the argument pretty easily that I think Dax Hill and Geno Stone together would be a hell of a combo at safety.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it's just, it feels like there's a disconnect somewhere. Usually when it feels disorganized and mismanaged. Well, let's look at how they've done things over the past couple of years. It's been pretty buttoned up. It's been pretty in line. To me, and this is just outside looking in, I know nothing about that. So full disclaimer, I have not been told this one bit, but it feels like that there are people in the building that think he is going to be a really good safety. And there are people in the building that say, hell no, he can't play safety. He's better here. He needs to play here. And that's what happened. And it came to a head because he struggled at the end of last season. Because if everyone in the building thought he could play safety, like I do, you would probably go get a Von Bell on the Monday or that he was released, or you knew he was going to be released, or you'd probably go get a Geno Stone. But you wouldn't completely overhaul things and shove this guy aside and put him at corner. And maybe it works out. Maybe he's dominant at corner. He showed some good instincts. I don't want to say full ball skills because he didn't catch the ball, but he showed some good skills. And I do think he's got the athleticism and the size and all of those things. At the same time, it's asking a lot. And you already have Mike Hilton. It's not like there's an open nickel spot. You have Jalen Davis, who they like a lot as the backup nickel. So maybe Dax Hill is just the perfect backup at all these spots, and you're going to have injuries and all of those things. Maybe you're right. He could earn a starting job. I think that starting boundary corner job is open, at least to a degree, outside of Cam Taylor-Britt. But it's tough because it's year 3, and they really botched it when he was a rookie because they should have they knew Jesse was coming back. They should have just put him at corner. If there was any thought of that, they should have just put him at corner from the jump.
Yep. That was the time.
And so what do we learn from that to now? You better have a plan for your damn first round pick.
Yeah.
And you regardless of who it is, Amarius Mims, JC Latham, Byron Murphy, none of those guys, there's a very real scenario where none of those guys are day one starters. But how do they get in? And it's easy to see. It's easy to see how they do. Brock Bowers, round 2, your plan for those guys too. So have a plan for your early picks, because not only do you need them to hit, you need to have a plan so you don't put them in a tough spot, because I think Dax is in a tough spot and he's handled it pretty well, but it's been a tough situation. We will get any last thoughts you have on Dax Hill coming up next, plus a little more on Joe Bachie and much, much more. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. You got to download the Gametime app. Why? Well, baseball is here. The Cincinnati Reds are one of the most exciting teams in baseball. Ellie De La Cruz is a lot of fun. I know there was some talk about sending him to AAA. Well, you got to get the GABP to watch him. And maybe you're not a baseball fan, but you need tickets to that next big concert or that next major event. Maybe the NBA playoffs. You're an NBA fan like me. Well, the Pacers are right down the street in Indianapolis. I mean, that's a really close drive if you want some NBA playoff action and you live in Cincinnati. Get your tickets with Gametime. Gametime has last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% on getting last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater. The best part, you can get tickets up to an hour after the game starts. So you could be hanging at Holy Grail, the Reds have started, and you decide to mosey on into GABP. Gametime is the place to get it. They have a lowest price guarantee, by the way. So Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. They have ticket coverage, so your purchase is completely covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Go to Gametime today. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account with the Gametime app and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed.
You mentioned closing thoughts on Dax Hill before we talk about the moves the Bengals made or made official on what day is it? Monday, as we record this episode. My closing thoughts on Dax Hill, a couple things you mentioned that I wanted to touch on. One, maybe the most realistic outcome at this point is that Dax Hill is the slot corner of the future. If you've used your first round pick for your slot corner in 4 years, if that's what that turns out to be, that's a really bad first round pick. Not because of the player, but because of your plan for that player or finding a way to get that player on the field. If your first round pick is a guy that's like, yeah, you know what? Didn't work out at safety. We thought he could move to safety, but now the plan is he's going to start in year 4. One, you're almost certainly not going to bring that player back unless it goes really well. And that relationship is really, really, better than I imagine it is. And two, that's just so much time wasted to have that be your eventual outcome. And to have him go from a starter in year 2 to a bench player in year 3.
Let's say it out loud here. If on draft night, everyone thought, oh, well, that's Jesse Bates' replacement.
Yeah.
If we would have said, that's actually Mike Hilton's replacement, who has 3 years left on his deal and is one of the best nickels in the league.
Yeah. It's ridiculous.
It's unbelievably bad. And that's why I hate it, because I still think he could be good at safety. I hate it. And I get it. I've been in the Dax Hill corner and all of those things. I don't know how you could look at him and just be like, all right, completely out. And that's a move now. Me kind of does that. No, maybe not. Maybe there's an injury or two or something and he plays safety and he balls out and he reestablishes all of that. But it's hard for me to see the path now, the realistic path, because DJ Turner should be a better boundary corner than Dax Hill. It's an uphill climb for Dax Hill to make. Mike Hilton should be better than Dax Hill. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, all right, well, where does he go? I mean, put him at receiver? Like, what are we doing? Like, what's the plan here?
Even if there is an injury at safety and he ends up back at safety, now you've asked him to prepare for these other things, and now you're asking him to, again, move. And maybe this is a reflection
they could do some of it. They could do some of the safety stuff at tight end and stuff. And we can get into the football specifics later.
And they could have sub-package specific roles for him in mind, and that's great. But if you're then asking him to go back and be a safety, and some of this does reflect on Dax Hill, I think, where if the transition to safety had gone better, we're not having this conversation, and he's just our safety this year, and that's it. And so that is part of it, is the way he finished the season and the inconsistency. So it's not to like totally excuse Dax by any means, but it is kind of indicative of not necessarily having this perfect lockstep between the front office and the defensive staff and having this great plan for the player. Maybe they just got him in and they had a plan and they had to pivot off the plan, but hard to believe that was the case, because we saw him as a safety. He was announced as a safety. He worked as a safety his rookie year. Then his second year started at safety. That was a succession plan and it just didn't work out. So either way, a failure of planning. The last thought for me here is take any nickel corners, slot corners you had as potential Bengals fits this year and just cross them off the list. Mike Sandershall is the one that comes to mind the first for me. The Bengals aren't drafting him.
I don't know.
They would have like 4 slot corners on the team at that point.
Sure. But I hate to say this. Who's to say they're not like, oh, he's 18th on our board and it's pick 49.
He'll play in 4 years.
But he'll be better than Dax this year. Like they may view it that way. He'll replace Mike. He could control. I just
trade Dax then. Just trade Dax. If that's your plan, just trade him.
I'm not saying that's the plan.
No, I know.
I just don't
I'm
know
saying if it was the plan.
The plan sucks. I'll be honest. It sucks. I hate it. I want to make it very I've said it twice now. I don't care. I'm going to hammer it home and you guys are going to hate me for it. Now, could it work out? I guess it could. But yeah. I don't feel good. Hopefully he just has 8 interceptions as the boundary corner this year.
Yeah, like best case scenario here, they stumble into a Pro Bowl outside corner. Best case scenario.
I mean, what are the odds? 2%?
Bad. Low.
It's just a lot to ask.
I hope we're wrong. I hope we're wrong.
It's not like aging veteran corner goes to safety.
Yeah, no, that's the opposite.
It's way different than that. I'm just putting it in perspective for people. Like it's way different.
The Bengals be
like asking. Go ahead.
We're just gonna pivot before you start doing your hyperbole thing. You're gonna say something about asking Jake Lisco to do what, a Locked On Steelers podcast? Because that's about right.
No. I actually think Dax has a way better chance of being a corner than you do of doing that. Way better. I mean, there's negative. I think you would pay to not do that. Just to be very clear. So you would go very much out of your way for that not to be your job, which I don't blame you. I wouldn't do it either.
And I think like the Locked On Steelers audience numbers would invert and go from whatever they are to negative whatever they are. People would actively somehow negatively listen. Anyway, the Bengals made a couple minor moves on Monday. One of those was Cal Adamitis. I assume was just back in town to sign his exclusive rights deal. He was. I saw him in the building before it was announced. So yeah. Well, he was to sign his deal for sure, but I just mean like he hasn't signed it yet because he hasn't been around to sign it. There was no other deal available to him, so he signed his exclusive rights deal and will continue to be the Bengals long snapper. Jeff Hobson noting that
he was hanging in Pittsburgh. Oddly enough, since you mentioned the Steelers, that's where he's from.
Right. Adamitis, as Jeff Hobson noted on Bengals.com, now has the longest hair on the team, keeping up the tradition of Bengals long snapper hair. Love to see it. The Bengals also re-signed unrestricted free agent Joe Bachie. And again, I assume this deal was probably agreed to and just didn't get reported, maybe didn't get leaked, because if Bachie's there to sign it today and then participate in the offseason program, you think he just showed up for work? He's like, oh, offseason program's today. And then they're like, oh, we got a contract for you. Here you go. You want to come participate? Here, we'll sign this contract first.
Yeah, I think that's pretty maybe, but this makes sense. Like their linebackers are good. Like I'm fine at linebacker. If Joe Bachie has to play some, fine with that. Keem Davis-Gaither, fine with that. So now they're 4 deep. I'm sure they'll draft one late, but there was a little need there, and now I don't really feel like there's a need. Just to get a young guy on a rookie deal. But other than that,
Marcus Bailey is still out there.
Marcus, come home.
I'm a little surprised at this point that he hasn't landed.
I know.
For the
you want to talk about a 7th round pick that they nailed? That's one that they nailed.
And a Darren Simmons guy. Like maybe they're just waiting to see if they can get the kind of special teams guys they want in the draft on day 3 before at this point they would bring Marcus Bailey back. Or maybe we see it, and this is one of those things where right after we finish recording, Marcus Bailey agrees to terms with the Cincinnati Bengals. We'll find out.
Jordan McGee out of Temple.
Just picking a linebacker. Is that a linebacker in this draft?
Yeah. 6'3", 225, ran really well.
Yep. I actually had some names, I think, for linebackers that they've...
I do. Why are you dismissing my name? I just gave you the name. They're going to take him.
That they've met with or expressed some interest in. So Jalen Green at James Madison, Maris Liafu at Notre Dame, and J.D. Bertrand at Notre Dame. The Bengals had some presence at that pro day. So, yeah, I mean, they're probably going to draft a linebacker on day 3.
Presence at that pro day to watch Audric Estime, baby. And that's the perfect transition. Draft, Jake. Yep. Draft.
Got a bunch of draft shows coming for you the rest of the week. Dane Brugler. leading the way. That'll come up tomorrow for you. Great episode with Dane. We cover tackles, we cover defensive tackles, we cover nose tackle depth or lack thereof. We talk about Brock Bowers. We talk a little bit about receiver at the end. So tons of great stuff there. We'll talk with Joe Goodberry. We'll talk about the Bengals board that we're going to put together on Cincinnati Bengals Talk to finish up the week as well. So plenty of great draft content coming to you in this penultimate week before the draft, before we get into those final mocks and that final pre-draft coverage we'll have for you next week here on Locked On Bengals. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.